Microevolution Part 2. Remember, alleles are different versions of a gene, and we're sticking with pretty simple stuff here in this unit where when we do Hardy-Weinberg, we do any kind of math problems, you're going to have two different versions of a gene, and you're looking at the change in that allele frequency over time. Remember, evolution is the change in allele frequency in a population over time in response to the environment. And so remember, environment is the driving force here, just like we saw in our bead bug lab the other day. Number 2, most organisms are diploid in nature. Now, there are a lot of polygenetic traits where you have many genes that control a trait. There are many multiple allele traits where you have multiple alleles that control a specific trait, like we talked about with blood typing. And so those you can't really do Hardy-Weinberg with. The equation, it wouldn't work with the equation. But like I say, we're not going to worry so much about those, okay? If you think about polygenic, that's like skin color. So, there's multiple genes that are going in, or the same way with eye color and hair color. There are multiple genes that are controlling the phenotypic outcome of those, okay? Number 3, fertilization is a combining of parent genes. So we're getting one of those from mom, one of those from dad, and then that makes us who we are or plant or whatever. Now, number 1 under micro, variation. Variation is super important. If you look around the room, well, we're pretty homogeneous in here for the most part. First period's a little bit more diverse. But anyway, variation is kind of the key to survival in the environment, right? So the more diverse the group, the more genetically diverse, the better chance you have for survival. Why is that?
There's more variation to the environment.
Well, if you have environmental changes or you have an environment that's fluctuating, some individuals are going to be better suited. So the more variety you have, you would assume that some individuals would be better suited, survive, pass on their traits. Whereas, now, hold on, I'll get to my next point in a second. That rooster's going crazy out there. He probably saw those babies. Part B, the options are the raw building materials of evolution to utilize. If there is no option or variation from which to utilize, species are confined to what's available, even if it's weak or unfavorable. Variation on the most basic level will only come into existence with changes in DNA nucleotide sequence. So, one thing to remember, the environment does influence evolution. But the environment isn't making changes. The only way that changes come into being in any kind of organism is through mutations that are passed on. So that's something to remember. So we say the environment drives evolution. Well, the environment drove a bird to get feathers, or really we know now feathers were around before birds. But even if that was the case, they're not. The only way that feathers are showing up is if that mutation in whatever the skin is going on in the skin starts producing those feathers. Okay. So mutations have to happen in order for those changes to take place on down the line. And they have to be a good mutation. Some mutations don't affect an organism at all. It can change the codon sequence and not affect it at all. Some mutations are going to be, I would say most are probably not going to affect. You're going to have a bunch that are bad, that'll be harmful, change something that you needed. And then a small few are going to be advances or good things that are going to help you out long term. Okay? Variation exists between individuals and populations unless the population is composed of clones. Now, one thing I want to remind you of from earlier in the year, Tay, we said bacteria and fungi are good examples. Most of them can undergo asexual and sexual reproduction. That's not all inclusive, but for the most part. And so if you're a bacteria or fungi, when would you want to have asexual reproduction? What type of environmental conditions? What? Harsh. Why would you want... What did you say?
You said asexual?
Asexual. And good. Why would you want to have asexual in good conditions?
To build up your population. And you don't need much variation.
It's just fast.
It's faster. So the benefits of asexual reproduction is you can make a bunch of clones really quickly and take over or colonize an environment. And if you're well adapted to that environment, or it's a good environment for you, then why change? Now, if you encounter a harsh environment or one that's not conducive to you really doing well, then you want to undergo what? sexual reproduction to produce lots of variation in hopes that some of those individuals that you reproduce that have these differences are adapted, will do well, and then pass on their traits. Okay? So sexual and asexual is really determined depending on, in those organisms, on environmental conditions. Okay? But that variation is key in order to having that chance of survival. Now, you need to know this because this shows up a lot on FRQs. Like, what are the forces that create this variation we see genetically? Okay? Before we get there, mutations are rare and random in genetics, mostly occur in body cells or somatic cells. It's really rare because, obviously you're going to have a lot less cells that are being produced on in sperm or egg. And so it's rare to see them show up and be passed on through germ cells, but when it is, sometimes it's beneficial. Like I said, a lot of times it's not. Sometimes it may not have any effect. Now, those mutations and those changes that we see in variation occur through sexual reproduction. So what are some changes where we see like the offspring are different? So like, I don't know if y'all have big families, but if you have siblings, you're going to see some changes throughout those different siblings, okay? Little small changes, but some may be more beneficial than others, right? So the first one there, number one, Walker. The process of crossing over.
The process of crossing over during prophase 1 of meiosis swaps genes from one chromosome to another. It's equal mate usually during gamete formation. This is so that each sperm or egg is unique in its genetic composition.
Okay, so when crossing over takes place, you're basically you've got chromosomes from mom and dad, and what they're doing is they're exchanging DNA with one another. They're mixing some DNA on those chromosomes. And so when they separate back out, then you're going to wind up with chromosomes that have a little bit of mom genes in them, a little bit of dad genes, and they're totally different from what they started out as. So you've created some diversity there through that process, okay? So, and then the two other ways that help that separating of DNA into creating some variation among siblings is separation of homologous chromosomes. We talked about that. That happens during anaphase 1. And then, remember, crossing over occurs in prophase 1. And then separation of sister chromatids or independent assortment. When those two sister chromatids line up and then they separate apart in anaphase 2, you wind up with the splitting of those different chromosomes. So you're winding up, like we said, when you take one cell and you make 4 sperm from it, you're going to wind up with 4 different unique sperm, okay? And then the last part is you make, what do we say? It was like 200 million sperm every time during sexual reproduction. So you're talking about, that's a lot of different sperm. And then you've got variation there, but only one of them is actually making it into the egg to be fertilized. So you've got all this diversity. You kind of got the whole survival of the fittest, at the beginning. So like, the first test of survival of the fittest is who swims the best, right? So which one gets there first? 1 out of 200 million, that's a pretty good odds, Matthew. Good job. All right, so all of these things go into the amount of variation that you see in the offspring. And I don't know if you remember the numbers that went along with this, but when you talk about crossing over, independent assortment, segregation of chromosomes, random fertilization, you're going to have, you basically got a 1 in, I think, 7 trillion chance was the number that they calculated of having someone that's basically the same genetics as you. So it's not going to happen, okay? So there's so much variation that takes place, even if you're starting from similar DNA that your mother and father gave you, okay? So lots of variation. Variation is needed in order for survival. Now, this is why you see a lot of species, once they get down to a very small number or small population, basically they're doomed to extinction. And the term's called, the extinction vortex, I think, something like that, where basically when you get down to a small number of individuals, they're so genetically similar because of inbreeding there's no way that they're going to be able to reproduce and produce fertile offspring that are going to be able to survive and do well. And so essentially, once you get down to a low number, even if you've got individuals, there's no turning back. Okay. All right. The next thing on here, microevolution. Remember, micro means small scale. Macro, which we're going to get into in a couple days, is large scale changes. Think of like birds coming from some dinosaur ancestor. Okay. Now, macroevolution can come from micro if it's occurring over a long enough period of time. With enough generations, a long enough period of time can lead to larger changes. Okay. Now, part C, this is important to remember, especially when we talk about some of the controversies behind evolution. So on part C, Katie, read that for us real quick.
Remember, change over time is referred to as evolution. Evolution is a scientific law, but environment changes from minute to minute, hour to hour, day to day, just as a genome may. Please do not confuse this with change over time with the belief of creationism. There are two different concepts that are confused with each other because of the misconceptions of the definition. Darwin's theory is natural selection.
Yeah, so when you hear people talk about creationism, and I'm not going to get too religious here, but you hear this a lot, especially where we live, creationism, and then you hear evolution. They're two different, they're apples and oranges, okay? So creationism is in reference to like how organisms, where things came from, where they started out, right? And so the theory of evolution, how things change over time, it doesn't address the issue of where things came from to start with. The Miller-Urey experiment tried to address that issue, if you remember us talking about it early on. But evolution and creationism, that's really two different things. Creationism is where did things start out, how did they start out? And then evolution is how are things changing? And we can see these changes that are happening over time. So make sure that when you hear these conversations and they come up, that you know the distinction between those two things. It's just an important part of understanding, things do change over time, and we can see that in a lot of things that we may not normally think of, but small-scale changes happen, and large-scale changes can happen over longer periods of time. All right, let's turn over to page 489 real quick. So, on 489, we're going to talk about genetic drift. So there's two types of genetic drift that you need to know. Genetic drift, what is it, Miranda?
Causing random change in the allele frequency of a population.
Okay, so drift means the genetics are drifting or changing, okay, for some reason. Read A and B for us, Tay.
Random unpredictable change in allele frequency that occurs within a population's gene pool. This process is more severe on small parent populations rather than large populations usually.
So we said the other day, in order to maintain genetic equilibrium, you have to have a large population. So when you have a small population, if something happens to some of those individuals, you can have a dramatic change in the offspring that results. Okay? So, for example, the first example of this is called the bottleneck effect. Okay? And this has a negative impact on variation. Read that one for us, Sarah.
Bottleneck effect. This has a negative effect by reducing variation. This is usually caused by a random act of nature, such as a hurricane. Imagine an island with a parent population consisting of variation within the gene pool. A hurricane ravishes the island, and most of the individuals of that species die. The survivors, the individuals who made it out of the bottle's neck, are now the sole survivors. They comprise the new gene pool for that population, and the allele frequency has dramatically changed because of this unpredictable event.
Okay, so the picture in the book, they actually give you a bottle picture, and they show some different colors in this bottle. And basically the bottleneck effect says that only some individuals are going to make it through whatever this event is, and the resulting offspring are going to look much different than the previous populations. Okay? So an example of this in nature would be like populations of cheetahs or elephants in Africa, where you have basically most of your big game in Africa like that it's been killed off or isolated to small populations in like game parks and preserves. So you've isolated the number of individuals, which means you've lowered the genetic diversity. And you've isolated them to one area where, so this group over here in this part is not going to be able to go over here to this other country or other side of Zimbabwe or wherever and interbreed with it. So you're isolating populations and you've reduced the genetics because you've killed off a lot of other individuals through, poaching or habitat destruction or whatever, okay? So you've got smaller resulting populations, and they're much different than that larger population that you started out with, okay? We could think of it like, let's say, I had a pretty diverse class this morning, but we don't have that today, so we're going to use something different here. So let's say we've got red, blue, green, and black. So let's say that everybody in this class, we go on a field trip, and this is just for illustration purposes. Don't take this literally. So, and let's say we crash landed on an island out in the Pacific, Walker. Okay, we got to survive. I don't know how this is going to happen. But the green people, we've got some green people. They're all hanging out together. They like to play the ukulele, whatever. And then we've got some blue people, and they're hanging out over here. And they would like to play the ukulele too. And then there's one over here, and then there's one over here. And then let's see, the red people, they're down here, and they like to play the ukulele too, and they like to hang out over here under the waterfall with the blue people. And then, well, I'll just leave it like that. So let's say that this population, a hurricane comes up on shore, and it's a bad storm, and some lightning hits and strikes a tree right here. And all of this group right here dies. Okay? So our resulting population, where we had red, blue, green, is going to look very different than the original population, right? We've still got some of our red people and some of our blue people left, but the population is definitely going to look different than what it originally did. And so basically this idea of the bottleneck is that if you've got a small enough population and something negatively affects it, then the resulting population that's left to breed and pass on their traits is going to be a lot different. Does that make sense? So you only got a small group that's left to pass on their traits. Now, another way that this can happen, and this is actually maybe a better example of this second thing, the founder effect, is a situation where you have a parent population that leaves an original population. Really, that's probably what I drew right there. And so basically what's happened, it's another example of the bottleneck effect, where you have individuals that go to a new location. So it could also be like birds on migration. And some bird just stopped over in Hawaii, Matthew, and they thought, dang, this is pretty nice. I'm going to stay here. And then they stayed there and they started breeding and they made little bird babies. Well, they may look a little bit different than the original ones that came through, especially if they stay there, they stay isolated. They're eating a certain type of food that maybe they wouldn't normally get on the mainland. And so these new founders are a little bit different than the original population. Does that make sense? So that's another example of where the parent population can be different than the original ones, like back on the mainland. Okay? Natural selection always has a positive effect on variation because nature favors the traits that make a population stronger, better, more likely to survive. Weak traits are going to die out. And like I said, weak traits sometimes can become strong traits. Sometimes strong traits become weak traits. It's all dependent upon how the environment changes. Okay? And the last one, I want y'all to turn over to 2312, which is on 491, this picture here. So we've got a picture of gene flow and local adaptation in Paris Major. I mean, they couldn't give us the normal name for these jokers. Anyway, so gene flow. Walker, read A and B for us.
This may have a negative effect, a positive effect, or no effect on allele frequency within a population. Migration in and out of an area may affect the gene.
491, sorry. So gene flow means that the genes are moving between different populations. Migration has a huge impact on gene flow. So we're going to look at the example of that here in a second. So you could think about the United States, right? So we've had a lot of migration that's affected gene flow in the U.S. We had, if you think 500 years ago, we've got primarily Native Americans that live here. And then we have a lot of people from Europe come over. And then we have people from Africa come over. And recently we have lots of people immigrating from Central and South America. And so you have this constant movement of genes that are coming in, and we have some quite a bit of variation in that over the course of the past 500 years or so. So, and that's why the population today looks a lot different than the original population would have looked like here, okay? Reduced variation can occur if the interaction between the populations is permitted to occur. They begin to merge into one unified population instead of two distinct populations. So this goes back to what we talked about with people the other day. Remember we talked about a long time ago, they used to refer to America as the what? Where populations, they kind of said they all came together and they were becoming more similar. What? The melting pot. So we went along with this melting pot thing for a while. It's talked about, and basically it said that, you know, everybody's coming to America, and cultures and food and all the thing that goes along with that, and people intermarried and interbreeding and having babies, they're all becoming more similar in this melting pot format. And then somebody thought, it doesn't quite look like that. And what do we say? It became more of salad bowl, where you have individuals who are like, we do have people come over, they assimilate into America, but they often retain at least a small part of their culture and who they are, and oftentimes who they intermarry with and because of those similarities in cultures. So we wind up with more of the salad bowl feature, where you have like a Chinatown over here, and you have people that that live in parts of town because of similarities that you see among those groups. Now, I think probably we're getting more toward that melting pot, because it wasn't that long ago where it was still illegal to interracial marriage. I can't remember how long ago. Well, it wasn't that long ago. And so, but now you see it's a lot more acceptable society-wise, and so people are intermarrying. Cultures get more mixed as we share more through social media, and we have different groups of people that come together. And so maybe we're getting more toward that melting pot. I don't know. That's a side talk. Variation may also increase if new traits are introduced into a stagnant gene pool. So anytime you have new individuals come in, you're going to increase that variation. So let's look at this picture really quick here on gene flow and local adaptation. So we've got this island off the coast of the Netherlands, and you've got these birds that live there. There's a central population, and then there's an eastern population, okay? In Paris major populations in Vlieland, Netherlands, on the island, the yearly survival rate of females born in the central population is lower than the ones in the eastern population. So females in that central population, the survival rate's almost like half of the eastern population. So why is that? Gene flow from the mainland is much higher to the central population than to the eastern population. And birds from the mainland are selected against in both populations. These data suggest that the gene flow from the mainland has prevented the central population from adapting fully to its local conditions. Basically what they're saying there is the island is a different habitat than the mainland. But where are the birds from the mainland primarily coming to and interbreeding with?
The eastern population.
Gene flow from the mainland is much higher to the central population. And so you've got these birds that are coming in, they're hanging out with the central population, they're interbreeding with them, they're bringing these genes that are beneficial in the mainland, but they're not beneficial in that island. And basically it's preventing what from happening? What helps you survive and pass on your traits, and well, it's bringing in some variation, but it's preventing evolution, right? It's preventing that population from evolving in the best trait. It's really preventing natural selection, because it's not allowing those local conditions to determine which individuals pass on their traits, because you have this constant inflow of individuals with bad genes, so to speak. Since the eastern population is more isolated, it doesn't get as much inflow of those populations, and they have a much better survival rate. I'll show you the picture here again. So the survival rate in the eastern population over there is much, much higher than in the central portion. So in that way, that gene flow has become very negative for that central population. Does that make sense? So you don't want to prevent natural selection unless you want more individuals to die. Good day.